Interesting hypothetical for everybody. So this is something that I've kind of thought about and just kind of want to flesh out in real time. It really helps me to think about it aloud and kind of formulate as I go along. But there's a really interesting philosophical inquiry that I have regarding value ethics. When I was writing Worthy, I figured it'd be important to kind of put this in here and then kind of reshape it after I put this out. The entire premise is about the sale and regulation of human meat, because we kill and eat animals. The sole purpose that we engage in such a practice is such that we tacitly agree that the problem of non-identity is by far going to be one of the most stipulating events in terms of moral consideration and well-being possible. And what I really mean by that is you take the argument that these animals live good lives and it's just potentially bad end, which they're otherwise given very good lives. And I really wanted to flesh this out to really refine and hone in on that concept of non-identity. And the way that I did that was with LabCorp Human Meat. So through LabCorp Human Meat, or LCH, we have a scenario that we have a variety of different options, and I further refine it more and more. So it starts out principally such that people want to eat human flesh. It's just a matter of taste preference. Human meat tastes good, and we know exactly what proteins, what ratios we want it. We can get a specific amount of fat or leanness that we desire. It's based on the basic biology, which we understand we can get lean cuts of meat. And maybe we can do some things where some of the organs have more or less fat, and we can really find an exquisite taste profile just based on what we feed them, what their diet is, more akin to how we treat some animals. Maybe they're grain-fed, maybe they're grass-fed, maybe they're fed macadamia nuts and beer, and we can get a really noticeable taste difference in the animals that we consume. And of the similar vein, let's imagine for a scenario here that we have LabCorp Human Meat, who is a global titan. When it comes to LabCorp Human Meat being a global titan in market economy, it's such that they have paid off or lobbied for the acceptable nature of human meat. They've gone through very successful and substantial advertising programs to show the good quality of life and the beneficial outcomes for families that elect to just raise children for the purposes of eating their flesh. They have a wide variety ranging from baby flesh to child, teen, adult, and a less popular but still more acceptable variant of elderly meat. People who undergo euthanasia at an older age once they decide life is no longer worth living. And through this entire selection, we have the premise of LabCorp Human Meats, free-range organic human flesh. Now you can get jerky, you can get cuts, you can get basically everything that we have of animals. You can get tricep meat, you can get a thigh, you can get breast meat from pectorals. Whatever your particular flavor is, you want to deep fry it and do that, you can. Or you can get some of the cleaner meats that aren't going to give you any debilitating diseases as a consequence of eating it. And after they've made sure that all their meat is above regulation and above board, we examine necessarily how this is to pass. Let's imagine that it is no longer legal to distribute human meat for sale of consumption globally. It's done so via vigorous testing procedure in blackout laboratories and blackout slaughterhouses to ensure that their proprietary and trade secret formulations on how they prepare the meat, how they preserve the meat, and how they process humans doesn't leak to other competitors. They basically have a small monopoly, but there are other fringe, more or less, companies that also do the same thing, but LabCorp Human Meat is basically the big name in it, and the small offshoot of minorities of people that also engage with it just are sort of known as like generic brands, and they're sold off to supermarkets. But what inherently is the issue provided that? Obviously, the first contention is, well, these humans are being killed and eaten. That's wrong. Well, sure, it's wrong in this scenario, but it's not illegal. So what makes it necessarily wrong? Well, we have a few stipulations that we can talk about at the very end, but let's kind of go through the process on how would you even acquire such a thing? How would anybody, as a rational agent of morality, allow for this to occur? What family would not be totally distressed by the fact that they're giving their children away to be killed and eaten? But let's kind of take this step by step. So the first contention that we would have to address is the nature of killing, the nature of cannibalism. Within the context of that, we can really circle everything else back to the end, but primarily, let's imagine the first possible scenario. With the advent of LabCorp Human Meat being globally accessible, we have a few issues with the acquisition of meat but doesn't lead society into a moral panic. Let's make it such that there are stringent laws and regulations for only a specific subset of individuals. These individuals are people who have severely reduced capacities, and it's by no fault or alteration of the parents. The parents come to find that they're going to give birth to a child that is devoid of most capabilities and is going to have a very minimally expressive, joyful life, and in all likelihood they may suffer more than they may live happily as a consequence. They would only have time with their parents, and they don't necessarily have much upside. So if the alternative is to just never have a child and never experience the joy of having a family, then it might be such that they would just elect to not have children at all. But that certainly wouldn't satisfy the meat market. So what we do is we find people who are in some situation in which they could really use the money. And they say, hey, I understand you don't necessarily want children. You just kind of want to live your life and be happy. But what if it was such the case that you happen to, upon giving birth to this child and raising them for 5 years for our child range meat, that you'd be paid a handsome sum of money? It's to be negotiated out with them later. If it was such that they'd agree to it, then it would be remarkable in their eyes. They don't necessarily have a care or an attachment to children, and it's not such that they appear to have any paternal or maternal instincts for either parties. So they go ahead and they conceive a child, and to the chagrin of them, the supplements that they were given to help ensure a high quality of life and conception with their prenatal, perinatal, and postnatal supplementation and medication protocol made it such that they actually gave birth to twins. It's fairly common for some medications to increase the possibility of having twins during pregnancy, and that happened to be the case. So they actually got more money. So now they're even more elated about the fact that they can now provide very comfortably for the rest of their lives the kind of life that they would wish to afford. We can find the first contention here, on the contention of an exploitation of one's bodily autonomy. Given the fact that they're only doing this because they're poor, obviously this raises myriad of contentions about exploiting somebody who's poverty-stricken with the possibility of a good life, even if it was such the case that they would otherwise just work and do X and Y and Z to get that. It's our first contention within the real framework of morality for human beings due to the premise that it is wrong to exploit people solely for being financially disadvantaged. The economically disadvantaged don't deserve to be victim of exploitation and engage with the trafficking of humans for the sale of meat. So that's our first contention. Our first contention is a violation of potential. And of course, you can always make the argument that, well, they could always just obviously decline something that egregious. But there's a strong argument to be made that they don't necessarily have a strong position to say no. To some people's eyes, it's obviously insidious. And it's terrible to think about doing such a thing. And once someone's been diagnosed being incapable of giving birth to a child that would otherwise have potentially a good life, maybe that's the only reason that they wouldn't allow for this to happen. You know, maybe they really wanted to be a parent, but 5 years down the line into it, they realized that they can't have a child that would ultimately have a good life. And after receiving that soul-crushing news and putting it away, just the idea that they could otherwise live a better life than what they currently are, and two, that they at least get to experience the pregnancy, gestation of a child, maybe that would be an incentive as well. But again, there's so many layers to it that we necessarily have to draw very many delineations on it. And let's kind of get back into the theoretical framework of what's wrong with the exploitation. If they would have just said no, it's no big deal. Aside from that, the necessity for these things also comes down to a hearkening coercive power of yes by a financial incentive to otherwise get rid of such a thing. For example, some people might just do things that they don't necessarily agree with for a life-changing amount of money. For example, if you gave somebody the option to press a button, just somebody in the world died. They don't know if it's a family member, a friend, or someone on death's row, or somebody who's really trying hard for assisted suicide or euthanasia. Maybe they're making the world a better place by doing that. Maybe it's a serial killer. Maybe it's somebody who commits egregious acts of violence or contains multitudes of problems, and they have a real difficulty in grasping what's wrong with intimate partner violence, and they go home and they abuse their spouse. You know, people could ration that out a million different ways, and they might not fundamentally agree with killing, but for, say it's $10 million or $1 million to press that button, they might be more inclined to do so. And with that haziness sort of elucidated, it really harkens back to they know what they're doing, they know the implications, and they know that that child, after 5 strong years of being in the presence of gestating parent and another normative nuclear family-esque approach, that even if they have reduced capabilities, maybe it's still just wrong to do that. Maybe it's more than just an intellectual disability. Maybe it's such that the child is born but has no capacity for emotion, has no capacity for compassion or bonding, or experiencing the highs and lows and ebbs and flows of life. Maybe they would screen out for people that, through the circumstances of their environment, basically give life to an android that just processes information and doesn't necessarily have all of the normative capabilities and functions of most humans. Obviously, they'd still be sentient. Obviously, they would still have the ability to feel pain and to suffer, but their highs and lows are deeply muted. So that could be our first contention with the whole premise of LabCorp human meat. But let's say that it's such that we have 2 parents who are now entirely devoid of feeling, and they don't care about what happens to their child, what they do. But they solely give birth to this child just to then have it produce human meat. They raise it, they go through gestation, and once it's gotten to a point of maturation, whatever the framework is for the company, they sell it off and they make a boatload of money, and they're infinitely happier as a result. Well, if it was such that not giving birth to any child is going to be X and Y and Z, and maybe they're in a penthouse or some lavish life, and the child gets to go to wonderful amusement parks, they eat the yummiest food that they can imagine, and they get to do X and Y and Z that really enriches their lives. Let's just say that when all is said and done, the child wakes up one day in a hospital bed, they feel a little drowsier than usual, they get a kiss on their forehead from their mother, and then they're given a lethal injection and they're killed on the spot. Well, what would be wrong with that? Well, we first have to talk about the qualm latent in taking a life, because we're obviously depriving that child all future possibilities and experiences. And that's not a very easily weighted thing to do. You could surely argue that, yeah, by not existing, the child has no subjective experience of reality, and that's just a matter of nothing would have changed in the world. But when you bring a child into the world, obviously they could have aspirations, goals, and to deprive them of their right to a future and all possible experiences, like the joys of love or the sorrows of heartbreak and all that it teaches and the bonding capable, we really have to remove quite a lot of that. So when we really get into the steep of it, that's our main contention. It's such that breeding for the pure purpose of consumption in and of itself really deprives life of any value so far that they don't get to experience all possible potential experiences. And within that vector too, who's not to say that maybe they would have just been hit by a car the next day and died, right? But that's another issue that we have, and that I just directly address in the book. It's that we're not the oracles of the future. We can't necessarily imagine what will happen. We could be hit by a meteorite, there could be a nuclear reactor that explodes, nuclear war can happen, you could be mugged and shot dead randomly, a car could fly off the highway, a plane could fall out of the sky. There's innumerable ways that your life could just arbitrarily end, to much of the chagrin of everybody. You can have an aneurysm, you can have a silent heart attack. There's a lot of things you can do to prevent it, but we'll never know when our end actually is. That's another problem for another time. But as we flesh this out, I really made as strong as a case as I could starting out, where it's such that LabCorp Human Meat has pioneered a small plot of land in which they have idealistic conditions for all of the children, and they're all coming in different age ranges, in different groups. They all play together, they're all happy, and they all seem to do very, very well. They don't have the world's most extravagant life, but they certainly are happy all of the time. They get yummy food that they want, they get to play, they get to engage with each other, and there's different camps, and different camps for different children of different ages. In Camp 1, we have a toddler care unit, which babies get to spend as much time with a nurturing mother who nurses as frequently as they wish. Their cries are met with joyful laughing, they're played with, they're kept happy. And eventually, it gets to a point where they've reached sufficient weight and range in which they're getting ready for the end of their life. This happens too with the child unit, the teenage unit, and then we get ones that are just steeping into adulthood. And for the predicaments of adulthood, I've outlined the following scenario. The children that are raised in LabCorp human meat farms are given extraordinary lives. They get to play with each other, they get to see each other, they get to develop small romances, they get to experience the joys of heartbreak, or they get to be totally infatuated with love. and there's some amount of the population that just keeps to their own and decides to enjoy the explorations of the world, where they're given small simulations of what the world can be. They're given a real sort of like matrix outlook to the world, where they can put on this headset and they can go fly out into space. They can go around and they can fly throughout the air. They can go see fantastic places, and that's their idea of vacation. They get to really quote unquote explore the world through teleporters and get to see everything. And it's such that the entire world that they live in is a gargantuan bubble dome that simulates all of the experiences of rain, nice weather. Some of their outdoor events get rained on. As a result, they think that they're really exploring the whole world. They take long bus rides that are simulated to take them to other states, other places, and they have no idea that there's an entire outside world they don't get to engage with. If they are, the violators are sent to innumerable series of years. They're written off as conspiracy theorists, and everybody as a consequence is removed from them and effectively re-brainwashed into believing that those guys are silly, that they're crazy, that's the dangers of drugs, and they show them maybe safer ways in which they could do X and Y and Z and everything else under the sun. But let's say that we have this population that otherwise lives an entirely idyllic life. And now they're getting to a point where on their 18th year being in the unit, all of them are sort of given the same graduation date. They all walk into different rooms to get their keys into the real world, for lack of better words, and they say, hey, you're going to get to go and get your driver's license, and you're going to get to explore the world. I know you wanted to be an astronaut, you wanted to go do this, so we're going to enroll you in these colleges. Come here into this room, you're going to get everything you want, and then you're all fine and dandy. They walk into an office that they think is going to be for someone who's a college recruiter, and as soon as they walk in, they immediately feel faint of heart, and they drop dead almost immediately without pain. It's been such that the entirety of this whole hoax is to make sure that they were unaware of the fact that they were secretly being brainwashed, that they have been given good lives, and that they felt absolutely no pain until the very bitter end. Again, we have the issue with cutting their life short in that direct harm, but certainly nobody could argue that they lived very fantastical lives. The sheer premise of them having a bad life is just downright laughable. They live enviable lives. They live better lives than 99.9% of the entire world. And certainly, just among their peers, everyone else has a small little laugh at the fact that they wish they could live lives as good as those kids for as long as they did. So we find that it's not necessarily going to be the most abysmal thing, but such that we still draw contentions for them. But that's not the only concern here. The only concern isn't just latent in the fact that these are people living enviable lives being killed for meat. Let's refine this step further. We have a group of pesky human rights activists. They believe that their human rights are being violated and that they cannot allow for these people to be harmed and eaten and killed and deceived. They have found that after decades of this empire, it's just absolutely hideous. And there's a large growing contention around counterfeit goods for LabCorp human meat. It's such a jarring and terrifying counterfeiting process that's been occurring. People are now fearful of the fact that they may be cannibalized. The fear from the cannibalization due to the counterfeit goods is due to a black market counterfeit products that are actually made from real humans who have been trafficked, cut up, and killed. This is one of the few and most egregious of morality that faces the most stringent and harshest penalties, where anyone caught counterfeiting these meat products without safety regulations, drawing in a profit, are then punished to death in front of everyone globally, act as a strong deterrent away from it. That's a fear that can never be escaped, with the idea of cannibalism being made, or at least a nagging, creeping possibility. It's not too far off from the same kind of concerns that we have for our own food safety. If we kind of think about it in the same way, there's a lot of, and I won't name them, but fast food brands where people joke that maybe it's horse meat, maybe it's cat meat, maybe it's some other mystery meat that we're not necessarily made aware of. And that's a lingering issue on just quality. And the possibility of counterfeiting really does have some contention. It's a bit of a step further in the refinement process, but I thought it was interesting to at least bring that up at first. But how do we stop the problem with counterfeit human meat? Well, there's a myriad of ways in which we largely have more deterrence than just fining or even capital punishment. There's a myriad of vectors in which we could have even more stringent laws on the tracking and the distribution chain and transparency and when that meat occurs. We could do things like QR codes, batch or lot numbers, maybe serial codes pressed on each of the X, Y, and Z packaging. But largely that would take a lot of infrastructure, a lot of money, and more time than what it's worth for LabCorp Human Meat and the other small competitors. And they don't necessarily want to go through the rigmarole of ensuring that there are cameras placed in their slaughterhouses and within every single step of the distribution chain. That could certainly open them up to a myriad of contentions about if there were potentially humans that weren't killed quite as quick. Maybe someone had a stuffy nose that day. Maybe the dilution of the gas was a little too strong or not set in at time, and there was some suffering that was a consequence of it. And we can see that parallel being drawn even within the context of animals being eaten and killed. We can see that slaughterhouses largely don't keep cameras on the kill floors or in the process of transporting the pigs. It's often much to the chagrin of the companies that kill animals for their flesh and put them in there, that there are undercover cameras or hidden cameras placed all throughout to help really exact on what necessarily is being shown to the public. Oftentimes the public recoils at it. So if it's out of sight, it's out of mind. And of course we can enact those, but LabCorp Human Meat has a different tactic. And it's not necessarily one that really solves the qualm of the worry of counterfeiting products, but can at least assure the public of the quality of their meat, or at least their new, even more ethically sourced meat. This is where LabCorp Human Meat really takes the onus on its name. LabCorp Human Meat, lab-grown human meat. So, LabCorp Human Meat has devised a very strong strategy. They're working within the health sector. Now, for anybody who's going to donate their eggs, donate their sperm, usually there is some sort of compensation, whether it be compensation for their time, in the case of donating sperm. Maybe there's a direct compensation for the donation of eggs for IVF and general reasons, just anybody who would like to donate their eggs so that people could have children. But such that with the injection of money from LabCorp Human Meat, there's significantly more money for people who donate their sperm and who donate their eggs. But within every single waiver of sperm and egg donation thereafter, nothing before, there's a clause. Your eggs and sperm may be sold and frozen and kept into utility to either help with the in vitro fertilization for other people's children, for scientific research, or there is some subsect of the population that may have their child use the creation of lab-grown human meat. So, right off the rip, they make it very apparent that they're only going to be screening for high-quality semen, high-quality eggs. Insofar that the donator does not know whether or not they could even be screened for it, there's a bit of a hazy definition of what that percentage could be. Maybe they could contact them and say that, oh, less than 1 out of every 10,000 eggs is actually selected for lab-grown meat for humans. And further, most of the male specimens that we receive such that only 1 out of every 500,000 men actually have their sperm utilized for such a task. So people feel much better about it. But also, there's a potential intrinsic good. Yeah, maybe my sperm will go towards scientific experimentation. Maybe it could help people with disabilities, or maybe it could be used to determine what could better help with fertility for others down the line. Maybe it'd be something I could benefit from. Maybe it's also that there's a couple who really want to have a child, but neither of them have suitable partners, and they need sperm so that they could be a gestating parent themselves. I could be doing them some good. So not only could I be helping the whole world, I could make a world of difference in one person's life. And there's only such a small possibility that I would even have something like a lab-grown child. And really, how bad is it that this lab-grown child is even being born? I mean, they've got all those genetic things and this and that. And I saw that ad where they basically just grow them as test tube babies. And they really do a great job in artificially raising them. I think it's not the worst thing in the world. So I'm going to take the deal. And let's say that it's such that LabCorp Human Meat takes people and puts them into a vat that simulates being in utero. They have all the nutrients provided, they give it a caloric equivalent to make sure that it is healthy, brimming. It's given specific ratios of proteins, fats, and carbohydrates. They get a certain flavor profile just when it's raw flesh and its fat is being cooked and rendered. The different flanks and parts of the person have distinct profiles that you only really can get through lab-grown human flesh. So let's imagine that through a series of genetic sequences that they've altered out any feelings of emotions, X, Y, and Z developing, we're basically just given a body of human flesh. Now, they still have a heart, they still have a brain, they still have all of their anatomy, but it's such that they're just raised in this tube the same way that a baby would be, or the same way that someone in like the Matrix is raised, and they're really just using them as energy. We can find a lot of contentions with the premise of the Matrix and how they're utilizing things, but let's say that they put these bodies into a matrix and they're basically operating their own lives, brains in a vat, and they get a whole myriad of experiences that we can't even comprehend because we're so ingratiated, we're so ingrained with society that our dreams, even the ones far more whimsical and otherworldly, allow for us to think like this. They just don't have that. And who's not to say that through recursive improvements in psychedelics and other drugs that they're not able to conceive of a multitude of different experiences and pure unadulterated pleasures in their dreams, that they arguably live even better lives than any alive human possibly ever could have. Then what's the complication of the harm that is caused by not allowing them to continue that? Let's make it such that we have scientists who control the rats and ensure the highest quality of well-being, and then once it comes time, they just flip a switch and they cause an excitotoxicity in the brain that renders them entirely dead. They're brain dead within half of a millisecond, and it's just a big off switch. Then what becomes the present issue outside the potential for counterfeit goods and the future harm of not giving them a life? We really don't have one, do we? Insofar that society is not overly burdened by such a thing like the LabCorp human meat and its potential counterfeiting goods as a risk factor for cannibalism or potential risk for the death of others, that's one problem that is hard to escape from society, unless all of society, through vigorous campaigning appeals, learn that only these meats, only sold in these locations, only sold by these companies, is going to be verifiably good and is going to be accessible to the public that has the privilege of consuming meat. And further, that people who are dead must still have their bodies respected. They must be taken to a morgue, they must be taken to a hospital. People that were murdered, people that were otherwise put to death, and then had, at least previous to their death, expressed a wish that they may be killed and eaten by their family, by the public, has been notarized, they've been deemed sound of mind, and we've really quelled out a large majority of contentions around it, other than a few people who are still dubious of such a thing and remain entirely devoid of consuming whether it be human or animal flesh in their diets entirely. They kind of revolt at the idea due to bizarre nature of consuming species meat regardless of whether it's animal or human. There would certainly always be some contention of people who wouldn't eat things like dog or cat or cow or human. But let's imagine that through vigorous campaigning and outstanding flavor profiles, it's really just an envious food product to have, and it's just something you can't really replicate with any other fake meat product. And it's just so distinct, and the mouthfeel is so fantastic, and it's just so wonderful, and that it was done in such an ethical way, and it was so fantastic that people could only really dream about doing such a thing. What then leads our contention? It's such that they were given good lives, that they were raised in such a manner that did not do that. What's the issue? We still inherently have a few complications. And these are the few complications that I still share about exploiting animals in any capacity. My first contention is such that it's wrong to end a life and to act as if we are God. I think that largely a sentient being should be given every single opportunity that it gets to live out its life so far that it does not do something egregiously violating to other sentient beings. For example, serial rapists, serial child abusers, and serial killers. Arguably, you can make the case for things like a Dexter Morgan in the world where a serial killer is only killing other serial killers to create a net good. There's obviously going to be fringes and things of that nature. Or who's not to say that an executioner couldn't be labeled as a serial killer. But fundamentally, if someone's breaking into your home and holds a gun to your head, and the only thing that you can do is reasonable force to kill them, self-preservation in most rational agent's mind is acceptable. You have a right to your life, and it should not be artificially or arbitrarily ended just on discriminatory factors as someone who's envious of your goods wants to rob you. You also have a right to protect yourself. If you're walking down the side of the street, day or nighttime, if somebody is trying to sexually assault you and they hold a weapon to your throat or the back of your head and attempt to do so, I think that it is within everyone's reasonable right to use as much force as necessary to liberate themselves from that situation. I further think that it's wrong just to end a life because it's been given an enviable or a much better life than others. that would certainly be to some kind of odd moral arithmetic that would otherwise leave us kind of devoid from wanting to have any possessions or many possessions, or really having any enviable experiences. And that would create more distrust and be very horrific series of scenarios in which just having an enviable life could mean that you could be killed. And I don't think that's good for the welfare of society or anybody. But there's also a lot of latent complications too in just why do others get to choose when others who don't want to die. And fundamentally, that's something that we can see all across society. There's a lot of xenophobic and racist killings that just because these people don't want to see these people live good, happy lives, and they think that it's at the detriment of their own, that they take their lives. And that's fundamentally something I disagree with. And even in the consequence of, if they hadn't been born for this, they wouldn't exist. I still don't think that it's fine to have the test tubes. I don't think that it's right for people to have to elect some exploitation and the utility of another's reproductive system without their enthusiastic informed consent. And that's one of the problems that we face between the refinement of the LabCorp human meat argumentation, in which these people are voluntarily giving their eggs and their sperm for this thing. They're voluntarily consenting, whereas animals don't get such a capacity. Yeah, it's such that they're bred and that they're taken advantage of, and then their children are taken away from them. And if they're a boy, if you're a chicken, you're macerated alive at birth, and you don't get any say in anything. And if you're an egg-laying hen, it's even more apparent that you will perpetuate the cycle, such a thing, just for human demand. And that's our first contention between human meat and animal meat, such that the exploitation is entirely non-consensual. And furthermore, the exploitation is just even more egregiously noticeable in the lack that the human people could at least elect to do so. And the contentions that I have with lab-grown meat, such that even with things like recombinant growth of flesh that otherwise minimizes the harm done to animals, there is still going to be some necessity to have animals to take these cell cultures from. And I've really tried to flesh this out in my head on how we could do that. Maybe it's such that farmers could get free veterinary care. If it's such that when getting veterinary care for animals that are otherwise normatively healthy or sick in any non-depreciating manner for the cell cultures involved, maybe let's say that a cow needs to have a wound on its foot fixed, and instead of paying the fee of some Y&Z amount of dollars, they can then elect that while they're taking the surgery, they'll just take some cells from the cows, the chickens, or the animal in question, and they'll use that as compensation for it. Foot fixed, and instead of paying the fee of some Y&Z amount of dollars, they can then elect that while they're taking the surgery, they'll just take some cells from the cows, the chickens, or the animal in question, and they'll use that as compensation for it. Fundamentally, again, we have an issue of the exploitation of the animal in and of itself, just for its products. But then also, let's imagine a much more harrowing situation where there are animal sanctuaries in which the animals are severely harmed, and as a consequence, they need to undergo anesthesia, but for the price of using some of their cells for lab-grown meat that the animal won't face, because while it's under anesthesia for unnecessary life-saving surgery, it's the case that they will then extract the cells from it for those circumstances. Obviously, that's arguably much, much better at the financial relief of the animal sanctuary owner, who then needs to pay for that. There'll be significantly less financial burdens as a consequence. But again, too, then we can bring up the argumentation of exploitation based on financial resources. But such that you don't want to propagate the idea that animals can be consumed as byproducts, and that the wholesale exploitation of animals as a packaged concept in and of itself, with all of the potential extremes, caveats, and theoretical situations involved, it's just against their principles, but they don't have the financial means to pay for all these animals in that capacity and also give them a good life. Maybe they'll feel that it's a necessary exploitation just to get them along, and maybe that's a form of coercive nature that they don't necessarily agree with, but they don't have another option. So there's still some contentions there that I feel are necessary parts of the conversation. But let's take it a step further too, for the people who would harken back to the economic impact of it. Maybe it's such that these farmers are going to do that, but they can barely necessarily pay for the feed without their insurance and this and that. And given the prevalence of lab-grown meat, that there's a reduction in the desire for real cows to be farmed. And maybe it's such that farmers just have to pay for all this veterinary care out of pocket without subsidies, and they don't elect to donate the amount of tissue for lab-grown meat as a consequence of it. And it would just be that these cows have to be raised by some farmers for the purpose of being a regenerative source of cells for lab-grown meat as a consequence. Well, then we really bottom out in just the reduction in amount of animals and their property status. But we're not getting rid of it wholesale, and I think that that's a large problem. Sure, it's infinitely better that innumerable series of animals won't be subject to a life of torment, harvest, which is a euphemism I don't like in the context of just animals in and of itself. And harvest is just one of those things that I don't like using it, but in this context, the harvesting of cells for things like cells for lab-grown meat is appropriate. We're not talking about the killing of animals as a form of harvest. The killing of animals for their flesh as a harvest, I think, is soft language that erodes the purpose of talking about animal slaughter for their flesh. I think that it is a softening language and a coping tool used for downplaying the actions that it entails. And maybe it's such that it's arguably condemning innumerable billions of animals to hell by not getting that. But I think the solution in front of us is obviously veganism. It's such that by rejecting the property status, we can make it such that no animals are subjected to this. And that by giving them rights, not rights to vote, not everything that I talked about and worthy, but just the principal factor of they are sentient, they can suffer, they can feel, they have a subjective experience of the world. They play, they build families, they nurture each other, they fight, they attack, and we shouldn't be intervening. I think ultimately that's where it really bottoms out, because otherwise, if it's not acceptable for 1 billion, why is it acceptable for 1 million? If it's not acceptable for any, why should it be acceptable for all? That's kind of my position on it. It should be the full-blown abolitionism approach of abolishing animal exploitation. And it's a strong ask, and it's a large ask, but the more I really try to reconcile it, the lab-grown animal meat really distills down to what percentage of exploitation is fine. And I can't reconcile an answer that makes that appropriate. Maybe you can make the argument of, would you save 10,000 human lives or 10 human lives for one cow? Or is it 1,000 cows for one human life? Or what is our trade-off here? But I think that it's a strong argument that it's not a necessity. It's not. Fundamentally, we have supplements, we have vitamins, minerals, nutrients. With reduction of animal exploitation via animal agriculture, in quotations, we can better use our land and our resources to feed many more people. We would have less zoo-borne diseases. We would have innumerable series of improvements in quality of life. And the entire premise of animal exploitation as a necessity is something that I'm working very diligently on, and getting a historical map of meat processing, meat packing, and exploitation that kind of shows us just the advent of it. And maybe that'll be another follow-up book, the advent or the inception of indoctrination. Maybe that'll be the next one that I do. So stay tuned. If, I'm around for the whole year after Worthy of doing this whole thing, that you'll get the inception of indoctrination, the greatest story never told, and just kind of how it proliferates and gets us in this mindset. But yeah, I think that would be a really good follow-up. But hopefully you've enjoyed this ramble. It's 45 minutes of just theoretical scenarios of drawing parallels between human and animal farming. And obviously, there's a lot of things about like virtue ethics and positions that people take about bodies just inherently have a right. But, what's the difference between a human body and an animal body? Is it species? Then what about aliens? What about X, Y, and Z, right? So there's a lot to be said here, but I think this would serve as like a critical commentary for just my thoughts behind that chapter. And obviously it's much more fleshed out because I had to write about it a bit more in depth even after this video, but I think it's a good one. So let me know what you think. If you think there's a lot of things I missed, I'm sure there is. There's a lot in that I didn't touch on in here about different vectors, refinement. There's some things I talked about in other videos that I'm slowly getting to building up and uploading, where we talked about maybe they would just torture the Matrix vat babies just because they're sadistic weirdos and all the other stuff. But hopefully this long-winded conversation about cannibalism is exciting to some people, or at least kind of gives people a different theoretical framework to view not just animals, but humans. There's always that retort that, well, humans are animals. And I never really take that seriously, even from vegans, because I think that through our connotative and denotative languages that we connotatively have this hard barrier between animals and humans. But if you look at it from a genies, a species, order, class, phylum sort of delineation, yeah, humans are animals too. Haha, teehee, XD, right? But yeah, I think it's very strong to make the case that when we refer to animals, we're referring to non-human animals, and it's sort of just a shorthand of non-human animals. But some people do. Usually it's a scapegoatism for not shaming non-vegans, but it's just, I'm getting in the weeds here. So thank you very much for listening. I hope it was insightful for you guys. If you want more like this, do let me know. I am certainly not adverse to doing a whole thing on philosophy for me about, I guess, like an audio format of it. I really hate using the word podcast, but if we really want to have like a podcast of my thoughts like that, I can certainly pump them out. So until next time, see you later. Bye.